day once again. Today we're up to lecture 7, Jesus in Jerusalem, the final confrontation. So I'd like to do 3 things today. I'd like to finish off the costly values of the kingdom that we're learning about as we journey towards Jerusalem. Remember last time we looked at the importance of following Jesus first in the kingdom, and if we've got money that can't be something to stop us. We looked about the importance of the great vision of God for one man and one woman to live marriage in faithfulness through life, the importance of being childlike, humble and so on. Difficult values to live by, but that's the kingdom asking us to live as God wishes us to live. So I'd like to finish that off. The second thing I'd like to do is the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, and then the entry of Jesus into his temple. And then the third and final thing, I'd like to look at what some scholars call Great Tuesday. That's the Lord's last day in the temple, where he struggles with the Pharisees even more than normal, and where the question rises, who has authority? Where does Jesus have authority from? And so we really ask, and Matthew's really asking, who are the authentic teachers to rebuild God's people, especially after this temple is destroyed in 70 AD. Next week we'll see Jesus actually leaving the temple, and it'll be a very sad moment for him, because he's going to say this: Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you that kill the prophets and stone those who are sent to you, how often have I longed to gather your children as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you refused. So be it. Your house will be left to you desolate. And then we're going to move into the final discourse before the Passion. So that's Great Tuesday, the Tuesday of Holy Week really, that we're going to be looking at thirdly. Back to the first one, the costly values of being part of the kingdom, of being a child of the kingdom. I'd like to look at 2 different things here. The first is the allegory that Matthew has for us of the labourers in the vineyard, from chapter 20 verses 1 to 16. Now this would be a story that's quite familiar to the Jewish people, because labourers used to stand in the marketplace waiting for employment during the mornings and so on. It was normal for them to have a denarius a day. That was a normal wage. And yet, of course, this story becomes confusing and disturbing, and one might even say offensive. Originally, this was a parable directed at those who criticised his acceptance of tax collectors and sinners. But now it's become an allegory with Matthew, and it looks at the last judgment. The focus here is on the first comers and the last comers. The first and the last. We've seen that before. The first will be last, the last will be first. First comers and last comers. We're familiar with the way that the gospel challenges our way of judging and evaluating things. But of course, as we read it, we have some resentment, as the first comers had resentment, that they were paid just as much as the last comers. But of course, what St. Matthew is trying to break open to us in the values of the kingdom is that we don't merit the kingdom. No matter how long we've laboured for God's kingdom, we might have laboured all our lives, and somebody has a conversion experience and starts to work for God late in life. Doesn't matter. In fact, we're called to be grateful that God is so generous and that the kingdom surprises us at any stage in life's journey. None of us merit the kingdom by labouring. It always comes as a grace and as a gift. That's one of the challenging values of the kingdom that Jesus is asking us to think about. We don't compare ourselves with others. What we do, what others do. We're all just part of the kingdom, and we accept grace as God gives us to us. The second thing I'd like to look at under these costly values or challenging values of being a member of the kingdom comes from the story of the mother of the two sons of Zebedee, John and James. Now this is an episode which helps us to think about basically our attitude in the community should be one of serving rather than having special privileges. Most of us seek a little bit of recognition. You know how we've all got to say thank you to various groups after we do things and so on. That's important to recognise and to say thanks. But if we're a member of the kingdom, we don't get hurt if we're overlooked. Because we're doing it not for recognition, we're doing it to serve the community and ultimately that the kingdom of God advances. Matthew, in this scene, focuses a little bit on the cup, because when the mother of the two sons says, "Can my two fabulous sons sit beside you in the kingdom?" he says, "Well, look, that's not me to give you that answer there. But I ask, can you guys drink of the cup that I'm going to drink?" Of course they say, "Of course we can." Now the cup in the Old Testament often means a cup of suffering. My cup of suffering is full. It can mean even death. Drinking the cup of suffering can mean I'm going to die. Now St. Matthew uses this in this Hebrew sense, the cup of suffering, again when Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane. "If it's possible, Father, let this cup pass from me. If this cup cannot pass by without my drinking it, your will be done." That's why at Mass, of course, the cup of wine that becomes the Lord's blood, reminds us of his suffering and death, and perhaps the suffering and death of the suffering of the whole world. As well as, of course, there's a tinge of joy in drinking wine at celebrations and so on. I guess, too, what the Lord is saying to us, Matthew is saying to us, and the Lord, is that even martyrdom, even if you lay down your life for me, even if you drink this cup of death, it doesn't mean you've got a special place in the kingdom, because that's not what the values are about. So Jesus moves from that, and Matthew rather moves from that, into a talk about service in the church. And the way we live together in the church isn't where those in authority lord it over others, stress their authority, their privilege and so on. But authority in the church is to be marked by service. The Greek word is diakonia, deacon. A deacon is one who serves, diakonia. If we translate that into a Latin word, it's ministerium, ministry. A minister is one who serves. And of course, even in government, the Minister of Education is a person who's serving the people, the children and so on, all involved in education. So ministry in the church and wherever really is one of service, not domination. And this particular scene finishes with some extraordinary words of Jesus. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life. He's here as one who serves. Jesus came to serve us. That's his mission. And we're here to serve one another and to serve our world. That's the extraordinary vision that Jesus has. And as one commentator says, those words are really at the heart of how we live our lives. Really at the heart of what Jesus came to do. He came to serve us. And we come to serve one another and to serve this beautiful world that we live in. And that's a costly value, a challenging value of the kingdom. Now I'd like to move into the second thing we're going to talk about, the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem and into his temple. Well, the first one, it's quite a spectacular entry into Jerusalem. And interestingly, St. Matthew's account of it is quite different from St. Mark's account. And perhaps by pointing out three differences in that, we'll understand a little bit about how Matthew sees the scene. And his theology, his way of looking at things, is very different from Mark's. Matthew, for example, inserts the Old Testament quotation itself from Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 9. And this quotation could have very much influenced Jesus as he was coming in to Jerusalem. He would have remembered this quotation from Zechariah, and he would have thought, when I come into this city, I'm a prophet, there are a lot of people here, but I want to come in a way that gives a good message. So I'll come in on a donkey. Now you've got to remember, a donkey wasn't a source of ridicule if you're riding a donkey, because in fact, in the Hebrew times, there are people that rode donkeys in special processions and so on. But it's nothing like a king riding a magnificent horse, of course. It gives a picture of humility. So this is a prophetic action of Jesus. And Zechariah 9 verse 9 goes, "Say to the daughter of Zion, look, your king comes to you. He is humble. He rides on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." Now, Matthew, the great rabbinic scholar, understands that that's a poetic verse there, so there's repetition. He is humble, he rides on a donkey and on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden. On a donkey and on a foal. But that's really poetic repetition. But with his rabbinic eyes, he has to repeat that exactly as written. And so we have an image of Jesus riding, straddling, I don't know how he did it, two donkeys into Jerusalem. The crowd reappears. It's been absent for a while from Matthew's Gospel. That's the second thing which is different. There's a crowd. But it's not so much the crowd, but the way they're present. They're very supportive of Jesus. and they're potential disciples in the eyes of Matthew. And they are unlike the crowd in the city dwellers, because they don't know who Jesus is. So the crowds prepare this kingly but humble kingly entry into Jerusalem, exactly as they prepared for the entry of David into the city of Jerusalem, Jehu into the city of Jerusalem, and other kings. They sang, they put down their garments and so on. And they sing. And what they're singing is the last of the praise of the Hallel Psalms, which is sung at Passover. And that phrase, Hosanna, Hosanna, originally meant, save, we ask you. But by the time of our Lord, it's lost its religious meaning a little bit and it's become hurrah. Much as when we say goodbye, we don't avert to the fact that we're saying, God be with you. Goodbye has lost its religious connotation, as Hosanna had by the time of Jesus. And then the third thing Matthew does is to add verses 10 and the following, and they are quite interesting. And when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil. Who is this? People asked. And the crowds, the good crowds, answered, this is the prophet, Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. Just notice a little bit. If we go right back to when the Magi came, the whole city was in turmoil at that stage too. And Herod asked, who is the King of the Jews? There may be a little hint of that here. That contrast between the crowds, the goodies, the city, and the king, Herod, and leaders and so on, the baddies. The second one now is Jesus has entered his city, Jerusalem. Now he enters his temple. 21 verses 10 to 17. Jesus would have entered the court of the Gentiles. In that court, which was the outer court, he would have seen places where you could buy animals for ritual sacrifice, and attached to that would have been buildings that the people who owned the sheep and so on lived. And so it was huge. But he also would have seen the money changers, because if you went into the temple to offer a sacrifice for the temple, you had to change your money first. So it didn't have an image of the emperor on it. You had to change it into Tyrian coinage without any image, because the image was forbidden, because it said something about the emperor being divine. Okay, so Matthew now, as we shouldn't call it the cleansing of the temple. It's not really the cleansing of the temple. It sounds as though in some way these money changers and people selling sacrifices were actually doing something wrong, which they weren't. It may be there's a little bit of too much emphasis on that, but the image we have in St. Matthew is not of Jesus cleansing the temple. So he follows Mark in Jesus casting out the buyers and sellers and overthrowing the table of the money changers. And he says, quoting Isaiah and quoting Jeremiah, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of thieves. House of prayer, den of thieves. Now we think if Jesus did that, there may have been some sort of overemphasis on the selling and the money, all of that. But we think ultimately it's Matthew looking back to the time. He can see what happened to Jerusalem, and the temple's lost its validity, lost it. And people are now for real prayer would go to not the synagogue but to the church. Now another thing that Matthew does, which is only in Matthew, he has Jesus in the temple resume his ministry of healing. So he's healing. What happens is he's welcoming all those who've been excluded. The blind, the lame, and children. Children meaning the little ones. He is the true Son of David. He welcomes all of his people. And even those who are naturally excluded from the temple because they're not perfect in some way, and excluded often from Jewish life, are welcomed by Jesus. And then the children accept him as symbol of the little ones. And they shout out to him, sing to him. But of course it's the chief priests who reject all this, as they did way back when Herod was speaking to the Magi. They know the scriptures, but they can't see what they're turning to, pointing to. And so then Jesus leaves. He's entered Jerusalem, he's entered the temple, and he leaves. And he goes to Bethany. Like many pilgrims, there was no place to stay in Jerusalem, so he goes to Bethany. There's no hint in Matthew of popping off to the place of Martha and Mary in St. Luke. Of course, St. John adds Lazarus to Martha and Mary. There's no hint of that, so we don't know where he stays. So the third thing now I'd like to look at is the Great Tuesday. Jesus entered Jerusalem. If you look at the chronology of Holy Week, on the Monday, the next day is the Tuesday. This is called the Great Tuesday because it's really the final confrontation between Jesus and the Pharisees and chief priests and so on. I'd like to look at three things here. The first is the vineyard, the wonderful parable of the vineyard. This is the centerpiece of three parables or allegories that Matthew presents us with. And it recalls the beautiful image of God planting a vineyard, Israel. It's full of tender love for God's tender love for his people. I'll read Isaiah 5, chapter 5, verses 1 and so on, just to give you a feel of this. Let me sing to my friend the song of his love for his vineyard. My friend had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He dug the soil, he cleared it of stones, and planted choice vines in it. In the middle he built a tower. He dug a press there too. He expected it to yield grapes, but sour grapes were all that it gave. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem, I ask you to judge between my vineyard and me. What could I have done for my vineyard that I haven't done? And so on. We have a sense of love, God's great love, in this parable also, because when he sends the prophets and so on, he says, afterwards, he says, I know that they will respect my son. That's a rather moving moment in this parable. But of course we know that he gets killed. Of course, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is that Israel has been unfaithful. It's killed the prophets, it's killed Jesus. So it's destroyed, and the vineyard is given to new tenants, meaning the church, and so on. And it is a little bit, quite a lot, anti-Semitic. It fomented anti-Semitism. And it has a theology which is not true, that God promised a covenant with his people Israel, then he stopped the covenant and made a new covenant with the Christians, because we don't have that successionist theology or that replacement theology. That's not the correct way of looking at it. We're struggling with something, Matthew's struggling with something, but he's certainly not saying the church replaces the synagogue. He's not saying that. There is a struggle there with the leaders. And what he's trying to say is that in some way the leaders have let the vineyard down, and there'll be new leaders of the vineyard in some way. It's more of a struggle between the leadership of synagogue, the leadership of church, than it is about Israel being replaced by the church. That's a struggle that's happening in Matthew's day. So the theology isn't fully worked out. And we could hear well too these words of Jesus, or these words in the parable. The kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to those who will bear fruit. Perhaps that's the key of it. Where is the fruit being produced? Because that's where the kingdom of God is. The second thing I'd like to say on this Great Tuesday is about the wedding. You know, the invitations to the wedding, that extraordinary one. Again, there's another Old Testament background, and it is a beautiful background. It is the relationship between God and his people being compared to a bridegroom and his bride. So there are references to Hosea and references in Isaiah to the relationship between God and his people as between a bridegroom and bride. And I'd just like to read something from Isaiah chapter 54. Do not be afraid. You will not be put to shame. You will not be disgraced. For you will forget the shame of your youth. For now your Creator will be your husband. His name is Yahweh, Sabaoth. Your Redeemer will be the Holy One of Israel. He is called the God of the whole earth. Yes, like a forsaken wife, distressed in spirit, Yahweh calls you back. Does a man cast off the wife of his youth, says God? I did forsake you for a brief moment, but with great love I take you back. So, we're invited to the wedding. God's inviting us to the wedding of life. Now this particular scene, this particular parable is not in St. Mark, but it is in St. Luke. So it's something that Luke and Matthew have together. Therefore it comes from what we call Q. And it is in a fifth gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, which is not incorporated into the scriptures, but it's another fantastic document which tells us a lot about Jesus. In Luke and Thomas, the focus is on the reasons why people won't come. But Matthew's focus is on the positive response of those on the margins of life to the invitation. Normally, when people were invited to a wedding, they received two invitations. One, the general one, 6 weeks before or whatever, and then on the day itself, there's a reminder to come. Well, it would seem that the general invitation kept coming through the prophets, but the response was they all refused. So there's a certain, no, we won't go. And then the one on the day itself is from the Christian missionaries. saying all is ready, everything's fine, the Messiah's here. These are the great times, come. But no, they don't. But the Son is killed, the city, Jerusalem, is destroyed. And there's a little bit then on the guest without a garment, and that is any of those from the margins of life, or the Gentiles, all of us now in this in the new wedding feast, if we're not wearing our wedding garment, if we haven't undergone a conversion of some kind, well, we're not going to be part of it. So that's the second thing I'd just like to mention to you, that these are the discourses Jesus is having, the parables and so on. This is his last word to us, in a sense, about the kingdom and his last controversy with the Pharisees. And then finally, there are 3 or 4 controversies he has about taxation, about the resurrection. Just a word to finish about the great commandment of love. Professional lawyer gets up, what's the greatest of the commandments? The Pharisees, he's a Pharisee, had 613 commandments, 248 of which were positive, and they sort of corresponded to the 248 parts of the body. Can you believe it? And 365 which were negative, which corresponded to the days of the year. So we don't know whether the lawyer is really asking Jesus to comment all this and get himself mixed up in the different schools of rabbinical thought. But then Jesus quotes the Shema, which was like the creed that every Jew knew well. You've got to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and so on. And quite uniquely, Jesus adds, as the same, similar, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. And as he says that, we sort of go back a little bit to the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus reminds us that we've got to love our enemies, and that the meaning of the whole law and the prophets is to treat others as we'd love them to treat us. So, in a real sense, what Jesus is saying about the great commandment here is saying to us is, well, there are many things to do, there are many ways to live and so on, but at the heart of it is loving God and loving neighbour. That beautiful idea of Jesus it comes out again at baptism, because we ask the parents, you've got to teach them the heart of our faith. And the heart of our faith is to love God and neighbour. So we'll leave it there. And of course, next week we're going to go into his final struggle with the Pharisees and the last discourse. Thank you.